Welcome to the London Business School webinar series, Leading Through a Pandemic. I'm Julian Birkinshaw. I'm your host for this webinar series, where we're sharing a lot of the bigger picture insights about what's happening in these rather crazy times that we're living in. Today, it's my turn to share my research, some findings from my research, some of my reflections on what's been going on. So to help me with the discussion part of today's session, I've asked my colleague and good friend, Professor Linda Grattan, to join me. Welcome, Linda, to this session, and thank you for helping me out.
Thank you, Julian. I'm very much looking forward to being the person who looks at the questions. So as Julian is talking, please ask any questions you want. I'll be monitoring them. And then once Julian's finished his presentation, we'll have an opportunity to open up the conversation. So please do keep those questions coming.
Brilliant. Thanks, Linda. So with that, I'm going to take you into some of my thoughts on what's going on here. I'm calling this Coping with a Pandemic from Agility to Resilience. And I want us to start with a little poll. And the poll is, how well prepared was your company for the pandemic? We were well prepared. We had some contingency plans, not at all, or I don't know, or perhaps some of you just aren't working for a company right now. Let us see your responses to that question. And let's see the results now. So we had some contingency plans, but only limited scope seems to be the biggest answer. But we've actually got people answering on all of these. And I think there's an important point, of course, I didn't know exactly how this would work out, but I think that's roughly what I had in mind. The companies that were well prepared are almost certainly companies who are, shall we say, close to the front lines. In other words, if you are a hospital, I would certainly hope that you were well prepared, and I guess most of them absolutely were. But most companies, frankly, because the pandemic was such a unlikely thing to actually happen, even though many of us had thought, yes, a pandemic's on a list of possible risks, possible contingencies that we might face in the future, it is just impossible to consider all of the different possible scenarios that might have unfolded. And I think that is really kind of symptomatic of the general problem that we all face in the strategic planning process. So let me just offer this as a way of framing the conversation. Most companies, when you look at the planning process, we project out into the future on the assumption that things are going to just get better, a little bit better every year, maybe 4 to 5% better, 10% if you're in a high growth business. And then to convince everybody that actually we know what we're doing, what we do is we put a few sensitivities around it. We say, well, it could be a little bit higher or it could be a little bit lower. I have written those sort of business plans. I've seen those sort of business plans. And I'm very suspicious of them because, of course, the truth is that the way things work out in practice is something like this. On the one hand, we see these huge shocks. My colleague Don Sull, my former colleague Don Sull, calls them sudden death threats. And I don't need to persuade you that right now we're in the middle of one of those horrible negative shocks. Now, shocks aren't always negative. Sometimes they're positive. And my colleague Don used to call these golden opportunities. And a golden opportunity might be the opportunity to make a big acquisition. It might be a huge technological development that suddenly allows you to sell a whole bunch of new stuff. And the point is that those shocks, negative and positive, are always really obvious in retrospect. But as you're looking into the future, you cannot begin to know when they're going to happen. And so the question you've got to ask is, even though we can't predict exactly when these things are going to happen, what can we do to prepare ourselves for the reality that the world in which we're operating in is turbulent and that these things will happen? The right language is important here. And of course, many of you will be proponents of this notion of agility, this notion that somehow we've got to be able to move more quickly. We've got to be more adaptive. We've got to be able to respond quickly when opportunities are required. One problem with the word agility is that the word agile rhymes with the word fragile. In other words, agile organizations are often very small, they're very fleet of foot, but they often lack heft, they often lack deep resources. They often have very, very weak balance sheets, which is why I've come to think that the word resilience is actually a whole lot more useful. And of course, these are sister concepts, but they have very, very different sort of emphases. Agility is more about seeing the opportunities on the upside. Resilience is more about avoiding the negative. And when we use the word resilience, it is worth reflecting on what sort of systems actually are resilient. There's a beautiful picture in the bottom right-hand corner of a tree that's somehow continuing to grow despite the fact that its roots are hanging in thin air. That is a very resilient tree. So I like this concept of resilience, and I think it's very much worth playing with as a way of helping us to think about the choices we need to make going forward. I want to throw in one additional wrinkle to this concept, which is designed to kind of bend your minds a little bit before we get back to some practical points. You know, when you think about the functionality of a system and you think about the shocks to that system, a resilient one is one that continues to function regardless of how badly shocked it is. A fragile system is one that the more shocks you apply, the less functional it is. You can also play with this notion of anti-fragility, an organization or a system that actually becomes more functional, becomes better, the more shocks you throw into it. This concept came from a guy many of you have come across, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan. He wrote a book called Anti-Fragile. And that's a wonderful book. It's about 500 pages. I can't say I understood everything that he wrote there. In fact, in that 500 pages, I never got completely to the bottom of exactly what an anti-fragile organization really looks like. The metaphor he uses, is you can see it in the bottom right of your screen, is imagine that package that arrives on your doorstep that says, you know, basically, please throw this around to make sure it really works, as the opposite of a fragile package. And so as we talk about resilience, we're trying to make sense of the idea that at very least, our system is able to absorb shocks, and ideally we want to even make it strong. So with that in mind, I want to give you one example, and then I want to give you a poll. Go back to the banking crisis. We have to learn from previous crises when we're looking at the situation we're in today. You all remember that pretty well. This was only a decade or so ago. And in the banking crisis, before the banking crisis, there were companies like Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, Lehman Brothers, remember them? They were what were called broker-dealers. And a broker-dealer, of course, was a bank. It was an investment bank. But it didn't have the same level of government regulation or government support behind it. It did lots of very, very risky things. They typically made lots of money because the banking industry does reward risk-taking. But as soon as the crisis hit, those broker-dealers were in trouble. They had no government backing. And it turns out that their balance sheets were really very, very weak because, of course, they didn't have deposits from customers in the same way that the so-called bank holding companies did. And so what happened in the early days of the crisis, we're talking September, October 2008, what happened was Merrill Lynch went bankrupt. Bear Stearns was sold. Merrill Lynch was sold. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, the last two standing, quickly turned themselves into bank holding companies as a means essentially of survival. So my point is very simple. The agile broker-dealers were great when times were tough. But as soon as when times got difficult, they had to actually convert themselves into bank holding companies to build their resilience, to allow themselves to withstand the shock. And there are many, many organizations, every time there's a shock, where in situations rather, where some companies prove themselves to be resilient and others prove themselves to actually be very fragile. So, poll number 2, how resilient has your company been during the pandemic? Very resilient, okay, not resilient at all, it's too soon to say, or not applicable. Okay, and the answer is okay. I mean, the generic sort of middle of the road answer, again, you know, if I give you 3 answers, it's not surprising you choose the one that's in the middle. And of course, it's going to vary enormously from sector to sector. There are some industries, airlines, the most prominent example, which basically have been wiped out and will only survive with government support. And there's healthcare companies, of course, who are doing very, very well. But it was very interesting to see how many of you said it's too soon to say. And I think that in some ways is actually the right answer, because resilience, if you think about it, resilience is a concept that, you know, talks about sort of surviving over time. And of course, you've got to survive for the first part. But when we're talking about true resilience, we've got to think about the medium to the long term as well. And I think what we can probably see over this next few months and years is you're going to see a lot of companies scrambling, if you like, to figure out what their medium-term survival strategy is, rather than just simply getting through the immediacies of the crisis. So let me just move on now to a thought about the different types of resilience. So when we talk about resilience, the starting point, particularly in a crisis, has to be what I think of as operational resilience. So our job is to make sure that the core operations keep going. At London Business School, our operational resilience is about making sure that the students we've got now are able to take their existing courses online so that they can graduate in the summer. We also, like every other business on the planet, is trying to make sure that we've got enough money to keep things moving. Those are the basics of operational resilience. But there's more to resilience than that. I like to identify two other elements. One is what I call strategic resilience. And strategic resilience is about saying not just are today's operations functioning, but are we in a position to respond to the changing strategic context in which we're operating? Because obviously the world is changing, the world is always changing, and staying relevant to our customers today and tomorrow is a huge part of our medium to long-term resilience. And then the third piece of resilience is what I'm going to call personal resilience, which is about the capacity of us as individuals. Those of us who are leading, do we have the leadership skills to enable us to do a really good job in these times of crisis? Does every individual employee actually have the ability to keep going when we've got loved ones who are in hospital, when we're not seeing literally another soul in our own homes for the next 3 or 4 or 8 weeks? So these are different types of resilience, and there's going to be some principles which cut across all of them. But before I get to those principles, let me ask you a third question. If you take those three, strategic, operational, and personal resilience, which one do you think is the most challenging for your company in the months ahead? So let's just get the poll up, please. And again, please just click on one of these answers. And the results are a dead heat, essentially. So everybody's got their own view. We're looking at a roughly 30%, perhaps down to 20% for the last one. So what does that tell us? It tells that every company is in a different place. It really does. And of course, some companies just keeping the show on the road is going to be challenging. And for others that have perhaps got through the operational resilience challenge, they're starting to move towards one of these other dimensions as being the ones which you've got to focus on the most. So the second part of my talk, which I'm going to spend maybe 10 minutes on, is just to talk you through 4 of the different principles that I think apply to this notion of resilience. And in each case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare kind of the traditional way that we might have thought about how organizations function, and I'm going to compare it with the principles that we need in order to be effective in these challenging times. First point is around the difficulties of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy meaning essentially everything is done in a top-down way through rigid, internally focused procedures. And if you think about it, that is a very, very kind of fragile house of cards. In other words, the people at the bottom of the bureaucracy often have no sense of what the bigger picture is. So what we need is emergent structures. What do I mean by that? Structures which are fluid, where people can allocate resources much more quickly to the opportunities as they arise. And I'll just give you a classical example of this. Go back to 2005. This, of course, is New Orleans, and when Hurricane Katrina hit. And you'll all remember this story. I mean, this was a horrible disaster. Tens of thousands of people lost their homes. And the US Federal Emergency Service, FEMA, was quite slow to respond. Whereas it turns out that Walmart was very, very quick to respond. And I found this quote online looking at the stories about what happened. And this is from the chief exec of Lee Scott, chief exec of Walmart called Lee Scott at the time. He said, a lot of you, talking to the managers of the stores, and indeed the people just working on the front line in the stores, are going to have to make decisions above your level. Make the best decisions you can with the information that's available, and above all, do the right thing. That is a classical way of saying we want the bottom of the organization, everybody, to just figure out what to do, use your intelligence, do what it takes. It doesn't matter if it costs us a little bit of money. We will enable this disaster relief effort. And so as we think about what's happening in the current crisis, it is worth bearing in mind that absolutely we need that initial response from those closest to the problem. We've seen great examples of that. But we mustn't lose the fact that the bureaucracy still has a function. And the way that I like to think about it is that in addition to having that rapid initial response from those closest to the problem, the bureaucracy can play a really important role in helping to mobilize that joined up effort. Indeed, only a central authority really can provide that level of joined up effort that is required. So we need both. And of course, any organization or indeed any national political system that has only one of these two is likely to get it wrong. We need both. So that's the first principle. Second principle, from formalization to personalization. And in some ways, this is simply the individual manifestation of the first principle. So let me be very clear what I'm saying here. Formal procedures are very good at telling people what to do, but they are depersonalizing work. They risk losing sight of the big picture. So we've got to move from formal authority to personal accountability to make sure that the individual feels that they are owning the issue. And again, I want to link back to the financial crisis, because there are many causes of that financial crisis. You all remember that. But one of the ones which I think is the most important, really at the heart of the problem, was that you had people in banks, in regulatory agencies, people selling mortgage-backed securities, people selling homes in Florida or wherever it was, who essentially were doing things that fitted their little corner of the world, but had no concept of the systemic influence of them. And so when we think about managing risk, we can absolutely formalize risk management. We can sometimes even externalize risk management, give the problem to the auditor or the credit rating agency, or we can personalize risk management. And obviously, all three of these things matter, but personalization ultimately is the heart of creating reliability and resilience. And I just want to point you to a really clever piece of research done, I guess this was a decade ago, perhaps even more, by two friends from Michigan University, Carl Weick and Kathleen Sutcliffe. And they coined this term, high reliability organizations. What is a high reliability organization? It is an organization like, for example, a power plant, or it might be a supertanker, this type of situation where any mistake, any error literally kills people. And they spent a lot of time studying these types of organizations, and they came up with this notion that there's a set of characteristics that these high reliability organizations have that make them really good at avoiding catastrophe. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of those right here. Preoccupation with failure and resistance to simplification. What they say essentially is people in high reliability organizations, this could be literally workers working in a factory. This could be the person who's doing maintenance. They are preoccupied, they're concerned about what might go wrong. Any sort of near miss, any sort of lost time injury becomes an incident that they want to learn from. What went wrong there? How can we make sure that this doesn't happen again? And they resist simplification. In other words, this isn't just a problem with this one piece of equipment. The chances are that there might be a systemic thing that led to that piece of equipment failing. So high reliability is what we're trying to achieve in our organizations. They did their study in a particular setting. Arguably, this applies universally. I'll just give you one very practical tool. We see this in the airline industry whenever a pilot's about to take off. We see it increasingly in medical surgeries, thanks to a guy called Atul Gawande, who wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto rather. And the checklist, if you think about it, before you go into surgery as a doctor, you go through this list of 20 or 30 things that you've got to make sure are right. And of course, you kind of know all of these things, but having that list, that codified insight into many years of experience that you and your fellow doctors have had, is just a way of ensuring that you don't do something silly while still giving you complete freedom to act. You are still very much in control, but this is just a systematic way of making sure you don't do something silly. So that's the second principle. The third principle is the shift from efficiency to reliability. Efficiency is about taking out buffers, taking out slack resources to keep our costs as low as possible. Reliability is actually literally about building in redundancy and slack so that the system can withstand failure. And that might sound obvious, but if you think about it, over the last, 50 years, manufacturing and supply has been sort of, brought into a worldview that came out of Toyota, the Toyota production system back in the 70s, which was all about reducing waste, reducing inventory, reducing extra processing. Anyone who's come out of the Lean Six Sigma movement will know all of these terms. And let me be crystal clear. I mean, I'm saying these are good practices in a world where we have a very reliable supply of products and services, where we know that we can get all the components we need them when we ask for them. And of course, the slight problem is that when bad stuff happens, suddenly all of those assumptions about predictability go out the window. You will remember 10 years ago, Eyjafjallajökull exploded in Iceland, and for 5 days, Europe had its entire airspace grounded. And there were many industries, the cut flour industry, for example, where the super efficient supply chains basically just ground to a halt, and we had to throw away an awful lot of products and components. So we can't always rely on having an efficient, reliable source of supply. So what do we have to do? We have to start thinking in terms of building in redundancy to what we do. And just to give you a little bit more breadth on this, it's not just about supply of physical products. Take the image on the left, which is meant to characterize the internet. If you think about it, the internet has been super reliable throughout our working lives, and it's working beautifully right now. The internet is all about creating this network of computers around the world that in fact is resilient to any one of those computers failing. And if one particular node on the network fails, things just get routed in a different way. Hugely reliable system. And let me just raise the conversation to an even higher plane, which is reliability at the level of a company or as a group. We all know that Kodak failed back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Many of you will also know that Fuji succeeded. Fuji actually found its way through the crisis in films that Kodak did not. One of the reasons Fuji did that is it had retained a chemical business. Of course, the world of film processing relies on chemicals. Both Fuji and Kodak had chemical businesses. Kodak sold its chemical businesses in 95. Fuji retained its. And so when Fuji's business of making and selling films died, Fuji said, well, let's take this chemical capability and let's create some new products and services from that. So Fuji created a line of cosmetics products, which is quite successful. Fuji's even right now, I believe, experimenting with testing some drug development to help us with the coronavirus. So Fuji managed to be resilient because it had a much broader set of products and services and capabilities than Kodak did. So I'm going to wrap up in the next 2 minutes. Let me just share one final piece of the story and then we'll move to discussion. And this is the shift from a focus on profitability to a focus on purpose or meaning. And this is built on this notion that human nature can take one of two forms, and both are true, by the way. One is that we're driven by extrinsic drivers, making money, and the other is that we're driven by much more intrinsic benefits, such as concern for others, for society, and for the planet. And that manifests itself in many, many forms. At the corporate level, this is a story that is well known. Let me just acknowledge it fairly briefly. There are some companies, ExxonMobil as an example, where making money, whilst adhering to ethical standards, is the objective of that company. That's from their website. Whereas a number of other companies, Tata is one very well-known example, have a very clear corporate purpose or mission. Tata talks about improving the quality of life for the communities that they serve. And I'm actually not saying either of these is right or wrong. To some degree, you see most companies now trying to do a bit of both. They want to make money and they want to have some sort of overarching mission. It is worth just acknowledging that the ones that have a mission typically are also quite financially successful as well. So this shift from, if you like, making money to doing good in the world has been underway for many, many years now. But my second point about this is to take this notion from profit to meaning down to the individual level. Because many of us right now, as I said in the intro, are sitting at our homes. We're getting a little bit tired. We're getting a little bit worried about what the future holds. And I've been reading up on this. You know, the attributes of personal resilience are kind of a fascinating topic. You know, is it the case that optimists survive when we are in difficult times? Well, to some degree, yes. But in fact, it turns out that pure optimism is dangerous. What we need is optimism laced with realism. And I just want to give you this notion, which I found when I was rereading Jim Collins's book called Good to Great. And Collins coins this concept of the Stockdale paradox. Jim Stockdale, Admiral Jim Stockdale, you see him pictured here. He was an admiral in the US Army during the Vietnam War. And he spent 8 years locked away in a Vietnam concentration camp. And one of the things he said was to survive that 8-year experience, he said, you must never confuse the faith that you will prevail in the end, that's the optimistic bit, with the discipline to confront the brutal facts of your reality. So this combination of the two, actually, in his experience, was the thing that gets people through. So we've got to keep that in mind as an attribute of resilience. And then linked to this is this notion that we need to find meaning in what we do. And I've been, again, rereading some old classics. One which I picked up just a few weeks ago now was Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Many of you will know who he is. He was a Holocaust survivor. He literally survived, the worst of the Nazi concentration camps, and most of his family died. And of course, he had some find meaning in the most extraordinary of circumstances. I'm not going to try to repeat the stories of what he told. You should pick the book up for yourself. I'm just going to give you one quote. Everything that is essentially can be taken from you except the last of your freedoms, which is your freedom to choose your own attitude in a set of circumstances. So look, I'm not even trying to pretend that our current circumstances are similar to the ones that I just talked about. But the key point I'm just trying to get across is we're in slightly difficult circumstances. Our ability to figure out what we're doing and why we're doing it and the people we're working with and our relationships with our families and friends as being the thing which drives us is what is going to help us to take some strength. So finally, what is the biggest gap? If you take those 4 shifts that I talked about, where's the biggest gap between where we are today and where we need to get to in our own companies? And just choose, obviously, one of them. I expect some of you think all 4 are important, but I want you just to choose the one that you think is perhaps the most relevant. And let's get the results of this poll up, please. And again, we've got a little bit of everything, but the profitability to meaning, the one that I talked about last, edges it as the one that's perhaps the biggest gap. And I get that. I mean, I absolutely get that, both at a corporate level as well as at an individual level. Lots of companies talk a good talk when it comes to meaning and purpose, but very few of them really put their money where their mouth is in some respects in terms of actually investing in these types of things. So we're going to wrap up now. Like my final slide is to say, look, we are currently in the depths of this crisis. As Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, says, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Operational resilience and helping our colleagues with their personal resilience is going to be a big part of the story in the next few weeks and perhaps months. But as we get through that period, we're going to have to move to what I'm thinking of as the second horizon, which is working on our strategic resilience, making sure that our companies are actually taking the lessons of this pandemic forward to make sure that we're better equipped for future turbulence. And that applies obviously for companies as well as for individuals. So with that, I'm going to stop my formal presentation, and we are in real time coping with the fact that Linda's just lost her connection, so she'll be back in a few minutes. So I'm going to take a couple of the questions that I'm just seeing here that people have put up. Is it any use, given the lack of historical examples, to draw up plans for scenarios? And that's a terrific question, right? In other words, you know, does it make any sense to draw up plans, given that every single shock is by definition unique? And the answer to that is, of course, you can't draw up detailed plans, but you absolutely can draw up plans that say, in this domain of opportunity or shock, there are things that we can do. So I'll just be very specific. The original concept of scenario planning came from Shell back in the early 70s. They had experimented with scenario planning before the very first oil shock. Now, Shell didn't know when the oil shock would come. They didn't know there would be an oil shock as such. But because they spent some time thinking through what would happen if there was suddenly a dramatic increase in the price of oil, they'd actually put in place certain investments, certain resources that meant that they were better able to respond when that shock happened than if they hadn't done that. So we can absolutely make sort of the broad scale resource investments. So I'm going to take another one. How can you communicate effectively about a COVID death in the company without being non-compliant with GDPR guidelines? Goodness sake. Gosh, I'm not sure I can answer that. I mean, we have to be both incredibly compassionate about the realities of the situations, whilst also being very observant of personal privacy. And I can't go any further than that. Obviously, you have to make sure that an individual's family, friends, everybody is open to the fact that you are about to share information about them before you even begin to think about releasing information about those individual names. So clearly compassion and individual privacy will trump the specifics of saying what's happened to an individual. Could you consider coronavirus crisis as a sudden death threat, and so entering the sudden events that we can expect from time to time, or is it another outstanding not entering the model? So this links back to one of my very first slides. Yes, absolutely. The coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, is a sudden death threat. In other words, it was, in my scheme of things, something which was unexpected, which caused us to have all the sort of challenges that we've got now. Now, some people use this term black swan, and let me just acknowledge what this term black swan means. A black swan, the concept comes from this guy Taleb again. He said that, you know, in the northern hemisphere, we assumed all swans were white, and that was just the worldview that we had. It turned out in Australia there were black swans, and black swans, of course, didn't exist until we saw that they actually did exist. They weren't even in our imagination. And the point I would often make about this is that many people imagined the possibility of a pandemic. Many people imagined the possibility, of course, that there might be terrorist attack, knocking down, airlines flying into buildings. The point is that imagining something and seeing it are two completely different things. So I'm going to move on to another one. I would love to know, and I'm not getting any preview of these, on whether Julian thinks the pandemic may roll back the populist surge of the last decade. Okay, so fascinating question. So linking the pandemic to the political situation that we're in right now. And of course, over the last decade, we've seen this huge shift towards populism. Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Viktor Orban, and so forth. You know, these populists have a particular view of the world. It's not necessarily a right-wing view of the world. If you think about Brazil, where, of course, we had a left-wing populist in Lula, and now you've got a right-wing populist in Bolsonaro. So populism isn't necessarily left or right-wing. Populism is tapping into whatever that latent sort of hunger among the people is for a strong and powerful leader, for a little bit of protection against the winds of change. And I absolutely believe, and I guess I hope, that the pandemic is going to be a reminder to us that actually international collaboration, helping one another, trying to create organizations like the World Health Organization and the World Bank and such like that, are going to help us to survive future challenges of that type. So I'm going to take another couple and we'll go kind of from there. I'm going to just flick down. In your view, this is randomly taken. How would efficiency pan out with resilience? Can we be productive and resilient, or is it more about survival? So look, there's absolutely a balance needed here. On the one hand, we need to be efficient. On the other hand, we need to be resilient and reliable. And I'm not saying for a second that we should throw out one in order to get the other. All I'm saying is that on the margin, we've got to be thoughtful about the worst that can happen when we see crisis situations. So for example, we look at supply chains around the world, and this links to the previous question. We have been absolutely reliant on international transfer of components and products around the world. And of course, right now, some of the ventilators and such products are not finding themselves from the place where they're produced to the countries that need us. And so one of the things that I suspect will come out of this, and perhaps Brexit was even pushing this in a UK context, is more local supply. We're actually going to start seeing companies be more thoughtful about making sure that they've got supplies of products in the places where those products are needed. Now, I'm not saying it's going to go all the way to the old extremes of 60 odd years ago, but we're going to see a little bit less reliance on having single source products that are sent around the world. I'm going to take another one, and this is again pretty much randomly chosen. Please, could you talk more about anti-fragile organizations? What are some real life examples? Well, I would love to have some real life examples, and maybe if any of you have got one, you should email it to me. Let me just give you a couple of sentences on what I think's going on here. This guy Taleb had the concept of anti-fragile. He used the example from Greek mythology of the Hydra. I don't know if you remember the Hydra. This was the many-headed monster that had to be killed by, I forget which Greek hero it was, it really doesn't matter. And the risk is that you slice off the neck of one of these heads, and two heads grow in its place. So every time you slice off a neck, the Hydra gets two more. And if you think about it, that's perfect example, of course it's a legend, but the perfect example of anti-fragility. The more you get, the more you try to kill it, the stronger it becomes. So that's an example of anti-fragile. Let me just give you one more example of anti-fragile. This is from Taleb. He says, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And what he meant by that is essentially, and this is a point of view, it's not necessarily a fact, it's kind of human nature, that if we actually do survive an illness, by definition, our body builds immunity. And it's a tragic situation right now. Some of these viruses are killing people. Others who are getting the virus are actually becoming stronger as a result. Have you looked at the relationship between resilience and share buyback dividend strategy, which has been a key element of value and growth? So I'm going to take a generic version of that question, which is that through the good times, this is leading up to the financial crisis, and this is obviously now from sort of 2010 up until last year, companies were doing well. Companies were making record profits. Companies were buying back their shares. Companies were maximizing their performance on a narrow set of dimensions. And of course, that is absolutely the profit motive taking precedent over the kind of the meaning or the purpose-based motive. And my point is that all of those movements are typically anti-resilient. In other words, the more we narrow our shareholder base, the more we're building on a narrow body of equity. Typically, that means we are taking on more leverage, which means almost by definition, our balance sheet is weaker. And so the companies that survive best through a downturn, of course, are the ones with the strong balance sheet. They've got access to resources to play with to help them to withstand the shocks that we're going through. So let me just take a couple more. I'm going to say, in the sports industry, how can operational resilience be maintained when everything is shut down with no date to restart? Gosh, I mean, not just the sports industry, right? I mean, I'm working in the educational industry, and, getting new students to come to London Business School when we don't know when things are going to restart is a huge challenge for us. So there are many industries out there where essentially life is on hold. We are scrambling to make sure that we have as much flexibility as possible in terms of, opening up of orders, so that when we're allowed out of a lockdown, we're in a position to restart quickly. And of course, that's easy to say, but hard to do. What it means is we've got to take our costs way down through this period. And we've got to make sure that we haven't killed off our ability to function, so that we've got every opportunity to bounce back quickly when we get back towards normal. Okay, I'm just going to take a few more here. Thank you for the session. How to build resilience, competencies and mindsets inside our organization. Well, I'll pick up on the mindset point, because obviously mindset is the way that we look at the world. And mindset is essentially a kind of a collective thing. I mean, each of us individually has a particular mindset, but we can do it at a collective level as well. And the mindset I'm trying to get us to take on here goes back to this notion of high reliability organizations, where we say, I'm no longer just thinking about doing my piece of the job. I'm looking across, I'm looking to my colleagues, I'm trying to figure out what is our collective responsibility here, so that when something goes wrong in my part of the organization, I don't just say, well, that's somebody else's problem. I actually take a bit of responsibility to talk to my colleagues about it, to make sure that we solve that problem collectively. So it's a shared responsibility mindset. And then to go back to something I said right at the end of my talk, it's this notion that I've got a sort of a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose in what I'm doing, so that I'm always guided by what it is I'm trying to achieve within my organization. If we are clear on our purpose and our mission, the choices that we make as individuals going through this are much stronger. Companies who also rely on state support, supply chain resilience, in other words, we rely on our stakeholders as well. Yeah, very good point, right? So we are to some degree trying to figure out how to survive ourselves. But any conversation we have about longer term resilience has to be a conversation, a joined up conversation with those who are close to us. And of course, the government in times like this is absolutely providing that safety net for as many of us as it possibly can. But those of us who can't rely on government support are absolutely relying on, for example, unions. They're sort of relying on suppliers and customers to just cut them a little bit of slack. And in my experience, in the short term, that works very well. Right now, everybody is kind of in this together, and we're accepting some of those costs. But of course, as soon as we come out of it again, there is a risk that we're going to go back to kind of business as usual. And I do worry about that, I must admit. But in the short term, I think relying on colleagues is absolutely something that we can expect to do. Could the excess of authority create chaos in moments of uncertainty? So this gets back to the question about how much we rely on top-down authority versus how much do we rely on bottom-up, emergent or sort of fluidity. And I guess, as I said in my piece, we need balance. If we have too much authority, there's a risk that the authorities will make bad judgments. And I'm not going to make any specific references to any countries or any organizations, but there's absolutely a risk that those judgments are not well thought through. And we do absolutely need our people sort of below us challenging us and suggesting ways of doing things better to ensure that those authorities make good judgments. Only the top down can provide the resilient joined up solution, but in coming to the right answer, they are relying on people below them. How will the approach to strategy change because of the crisis? Will companies think more in terms of risks, scenarios, and pay more attention to these risks? Is that the rational thing to do? So I've been around for quite a few years, working on helping companies figure out their strategies. And I was around in the post-financial crisis era, in the post-9/11 era, and I even remember the Icelandic volcano. And for a very short period of time after each of these crises, companies were incredibly thoughtful about these issues of resilience and reliability. Unfortunately, that did not last. And within a year or so after those crises, companies, a lot of them went back to normal. Let's hope we don't do that again this time. Linda, it sounds like we've had resilience problems of our own. Thank you.
I'm sorry about that, Julian. Can I just ask, shall we just ask, I've been monitoring all the questions here. I'm sure you've answered lots of them. The one that I was particularly interested in was this question, and perhaps you've answered it already, is, because, sorry, I lost the connection, is whether you think that after this pandemic, the whole field of strategic planning and strategic change management is theoretically going to change. I mean, one person wondered, for example, will we have more scenario planning? What's your view on that?
So yes, I think, look, strategic planning as a discipline has been on its way out for years. I think it had its peak in the 1980s or something, but there's still a lot of people out there with planning in their job title, and there's still huge armies of planners in many organizations. And so I do hope that actually those organizations rethink fully what they are trying to do, because, you know, of course we need some level of planning. We've got to be able to have a point of view, if only to make sure we've got enough money available to finance those plans, right? But the idea that you could have a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan which was fixed has been nonsense for years, as far as I'm concerned. And I suspect this will be the last nail in the coffin of that point of view. Yes, more scenario planning will be definitely welcome.
Yeah, because actually, really, when you think about it, it's only the oil companies, I'm thinking of Shell's scenario planning, that have really invested in that. Yeah. Do you think it's time that companies now really think about investing in scenario planning? Because it's a pretty expensive process.
It is, and there's a well-developed tools, and many people, perhaps even if you're on this call, will be actually experts in doing this. It's a great process. It's expensive to do it right. The one point I'll make, though, is that scenario planning is great when the people at the top listen to the scenario planners, if you see what I mean. I had a guy called Nick Turner join my class recently, and he said he's been involved in several of these sessions where he, as a scenario planner, came up with ultimately what was a very effective scenario, which was then essentially ignored by the board because they found it too fancy.
So another question that I found fascinating was the whole question of resilience and efficiency. I mean, one of the things you're saying about building resilience is you build slack into the system. But a couple of people right now said, hang on, we're really, cash strapped right now. It's really hard for us. It feels hard for us to build resilience right now when we feel as if we're in survival mode.
Yeah. And I guess whilst you're in survival mode, you have got no choice but to do what it takes to survive. And my point on resilience and building redundancy and duplicate sources of supply is really sort of the next round as we come out of this and start building systems which are going to be resilient into the future. And after a couple of years, hopefully we've got a few buffers back again. That is when we can start to make those sort of investments.
So just as we wrap up, Julian, for those who are in survival mode right now, from week to week, looking at their cash flows, what are the 3 actions you think they should be taking right now?
Crikey, you want 3, and I'm going to come up with 2, and then maybe you can provide me with a 3rd. Look, I mean, the first is very simply around the basics of financing, and of course everybody's on the phone to their banks, and everybody is looking to extend lines of credit and to shore up their finances in whatever way they can. Secondly, linked to that is if you're a company that's been hit, you have no choice but to take some sort of salary sacrifice. And many organizations have already done this. My personal point of view is that has to be widely shared. It should be the best paid people who are taking that sacrifice, first of all, to make sure that you take your costs as low as you possibly can. So that would be my second point. And then the third one is really about trying to make sure that the operations that you build over the next few months are resilient to that upturn that we hope will come fairly soon. And it looks to me as, unfortunately, Linda's dropped again. So we're going to move now to close. And apologies for the challenges, but I think we've all experienced these difficulties in our own virtual meetings. Let me now, before we finish, just draw your attention to our next webinar. which is my colleague Andrew Scott, Professor Andrew Scott. He's a professor of economics. He also, by the way, wrote a book called The 100-Year Life with Linda, who you just saw briefly. And he's going to be sharing some thoughts on not just sort of economics and how the pandemic has hit the world of economics, but also how businesses are starting to respond to those trends. So you can also see on that slide, you can see our website, the london.edu/pandemic webinars. That gives you the link not just to Andrew's webinar, but also to the next 8 webinars that are coming up in the next 3 or 4 weeks, and also to all the materials that we put together to support this series. So the videos from this and the other ones will go onto that website. So with that, we are going to close. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for bearing with us with our technical difficulties, and we look forward to seeing you again on Friday. Thank you.